Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and you're listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Anne Sullivan. Anne is a senior counsel with Hogan Lovells, and I'm also joined by Megan Ridley-Kaye. Megan is a partner with Hogan Lovells. Hogan Lovells is a law firm for those that may not be familiar with it. Anne, can you please tell a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do at the firm?
Sure. I have been a member of the Hogan Lovells energy regulatory practice for most of my career, with the exception of 7.5 years that I spent at the U.S. Department of Energy, where I was the general counsel, and before that, deputy general counsel for environment and nuclear programs. My practice these days focuses mostly on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, all the incentives available to support the energy transition, and on energy efficiency regulation, which is another area where the Department of Energy is very active. Previously, I also did a fair bit on LNG export applications filed with the Department of Energy. But those are on hold right now, so I haven't done any of that lately. But really totally focused on the energy transition and climate change in what I do day to day.
All right. And Megan, please tell a little bit about yourself, too.
Sure. I'm a mergers and acquisitions partner in our New York office. I focus on energy and commodities. I have that focus because, like Anne, I had an interlude in the middle of my career. I went in-house to a trading shop, so a commodities trading company, and that's where I found my love of commodities and energy, and I've worked in that sector ever since. Nowadays, I get to do mergers and acquisitions, equity investments, joint ventures, and the like, both in clean energy and traditional energy spaces, as well as in the interim fuel spaces, so interim solutions like renewable fuels. And as you and your listeners know well, we're living through a time of extreme volatility in this sector because of regulatory change, demand change, technological change, and geopolitics. I find that extremely exciting. There's always a new challenge, but I always turn to Anne and her team and our legislative affairs team to understand what's next and to help clients make big investment decisions and look around the corner and see what's next.
Yeah, and there is a lot around the corner. I think we've got a big election coming up in the fall. Obviously, Trump and Harris are both running for president in the U.S., and that's kind of why I wanted to have you both on the program and kind of talk about how a different president will affect the electric power industry. Now, we've obviously seen President Trump in action 4 years ago when he was president. We don't necessarily know exactly how a Harris presidency would look, but what do you both see? And I guess I'll start with you, Anne. How would each candidate's energy policies differ from your point of view?
You know, I will say that the most pronounced difference may be in the rhetoric. Or the vocabulary, if you prefer that. A Trump administration, I think, would talk a lot more about energy security, energy independence, and the need to be friendly to American-made fossil fuels. A Harris administration, I assume, will follow in the footsteps of the Biden administration and focus on the need to respond to climate change and build on, what have truly been unprecedented accomplishments under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the IRA. A Trump administration might seek to repeal in its entirety or in substantial part the Inflation Reduction Act. I think recent indications are that it has now a fair bit of support in Congress, so that may be hard to achieve. One very specific area where I think we'd see a big difference is on offshore wind and probably wind more generally. Donald Trump has been clear for a very long time that he doesn't like wind power and particularly doesn't like offshore wind. And I think Kamala Harris recognizes that offshore wind is particularly valuable because of its proximity to population centers. It's a carbon-free power that is proximate to population centers. At a more general level, I think you'd see more activism from a Harris administration, more market orientation in a Trump administration. Trump has been somewhat mixed in what he's said about vehicle electrification, so he may or may not be friendly to that, but I expect a Harris administration will be all in on the transition to EVs. EPA regulation of power plant emissions has been the ultimate political football through at least the last 3 administrations, and I think we'll see big differences there. And then the LNG pause that I mentioned earlier would come to an end, I think, for almost certainly under Trump. I think the Harris administration will maybe push to wrap up the further analysis that DOE concluded it needed to do of the impacts of the larger than expected LNG export requests. So those are the big areas of difference that I see. I don't know, Megan, what your view is on whether I've left out something important.
You have not, but maybe we double click on the IRA a little bit and the fate of the IRA under each of the potential administrations. Obviously, key to what happens there is what happens in Congress. But as you said, it seems increasingly unlikely that it will be repealed. There was murmur about this for a long time on the Republican side, as it is one of Biden's significant, notable legislative achievements. But now that a letter has been released showing that there is probably not enough support in Congress to repeal it, it seems stickier than ever. Of course, the permutations are if Republicans win the presidency and control Congress, and frankly, even if they don't control Congress, it looks highly unlikely that repeal will happen. It's possible there could be some trimming around the edges, though. There's been speculation that some of the tax credits might be trimmed in order to provide revenue offset for other tax credits that the Republicans would like to put in place. It's also possible, and I think this is probably true under either administration, that tighter restrictions could be put in place with respect to domestic manufacturing and restrictions around anything Chinese or Russian. And further, I think we will continue to see more emphasis on prevailing wage and domestic content rules. It could be that the Republicans, there's some speculation that they may peel back some of those restrictions. And then, of course, if the Democrats win, then I think we're looking at probably nothing happening, maybe some tightening from a perspective of geopolitical reasons. But that's all to say, I think the IRA is here to stay for the long haul.
You know, Aaron, I also think I agree exactly with what Megan said, but I also think it's important to recognize that there are some ways in which policy is likely to be similar, no matter which of them is elected. I think they will both recognize the need for more power transmission and more power generation. Although the Biden administration has talked a good game about greening power generation, they have also very much pursued an all-of-the-above approach to generation resources, and I would expect that to continue in a Harris administration just because there are so many new demands for electricity. The data centers, AI, vehicle electrification, the sort of electrify everything movement that some people talk about. 2 other areas that I would expect them to be pretty similar are on nuclear power, previously not a favorite for many Democrats, but climate change seems to have changed that attitude, and support for carbon capture and storage. The 2 administrations might have different motivations for pursuing that, but I think either one will support further technology development there.
The 45Q tax credit.
Can you talk a little bit about that for listeners that might not be familiar with it?
It's a tax credit that pre-existed the IRA, in fact, I believe 2008-ish, but was beefed up and got a lot more attention when it became enhanced during the IRA. So it is 45Q. The other notable credits under the IRA are the 45Z, which is the renewable fuel credit, the 45V, which is the hydrogen credit, and then the 45X, which is kind of a mishmash, but more sort of solar components and critical minerals is how I'll describe it.
But 45Q is focused on tax credits for capturing and sequestering carbon.
Thank you. Yes.
Very good. And Marianne, you brought up EPA differences between the potential administrations. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how, as you said, we've kind of been flip-flopping every time a new administration takes over, what gets repealed, what gets enacted. What do you think we'd see if the Republicans took over?
It's the power plant emissions standards that have been adopted, repealed, readopted, and I would expect they would be re-repealed under Trump. More recently, the Biden administration has begun to focus on methane emissions from natural gas production and transmission, and I would expect we would see the Trump administration pull back on those. And I would expect more litigation, which is also what we've seen since the emissions limits, which were designed to decarbonize. That has been the principal regulatory handle to decarbonize power generation is the EPA regulations. My world is much more the Department of Energy, and they focus on developing new technologies and incentivizing carbon-free power. EPA, on the other hand, has put more direct regulatory limits, and I just expect that to continue for probably a few more administrations.
Maybe it's going to continue forever. I don't know.
Maybe. The other area where we might see the Trump administration push for more light-handed regulation is on permitting of energy infrastructure projects, just in the general approach to more light-handed regulation generally. But that more light-handed regulation on permitting helps the carbon-free power projects as much as the carbon-intensive power projects. It cuts both ways.
Sure. What about deal making? You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Republicans are more in favor of allowing larger companies to be formed, whereas maybe the Democrats are trying to break up monopolies and things like that. Is that a correct statement, or am I off target with that?
I think what you're getting at is the rather robust enforcement attitude the FTC and the DOJ have had under the Biden administration. That is indeed the approach, and that's a contrast to the prior Trump administration. I think we would expect that under a Harris administration that robust enforcement would continue. And I think what you're getting at is that there have been perhaps a chilling effect. A lot of deals have not happened because there is a perceived heightened risk of not getting through an antitrust approval. So that is one place just generally not unique to the sector at all that we are watching, and that will, I think, change substantially on a Trump versus Harris administration.
But Megan, isn't it true that in the power generation space, there are many, many, many players, and you don't have the level of concentration you would see in technology sectors and other sectors?
Yeah, I think that's right. But generally speaking, if we pan out a little bit, if we look at the sector wide and beyond the sector, it has been a much more active enforcement environment than ever before.
Yeah, for sure.
Obviously, we've seen huge investments under the Biden administration in infrastructure and in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. What would you see going forward under either a Trump or Harris administration? Would we see more investments or cutbacks in some of those, or what do you think?
You know, my take on this is that there has been, under the Inflation Investment and Jobs Act and the IRA, an unprecedented level of federal support for emerging energy technologies. And the projects that are being funded or that are getting tax credits are huge. I mean, I've seen estimates that it's sparking 1.6 trillion in investment. So you not only have the federal monies there, but you also have the private investment. And those projects take years to develop. But also because they had a big price tag, I would not expect to see a second round of IIJA funding. The tax credits extend by their terms into the 30s. So those are there, and the transactions, I think, will continue to happen. In fact, Megan, haven't you seen some folks taking a wait and see attitude? You might want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. So certainly the government has made major investments, but private parties have also made major investments. And some of our clients have considered whether or not they want to wait until after the election to take the plunge to see what happens with the IRA and the tax credits. Or maybe they stagger their investments such that they're not fully exposed to one of these projects that is the econs of which are contingent upon the tax credits being viable. And so there is some reticence. That's one subset of clients. I would say that we do have a large group of clients that would say the train has left the station. Corporate America expects the tax credits. There's no way that they would be taken away. And in order to make investments like Marianne is talking about, big investments, big infrastructure investments, private or otherwise, there's a long time period from when you make a decision to do that to when it's actually operational and eligible for a credit. And so to some extent, clients, even if they make that decision now, they won't know the outcome until later, which is when I call Marianne and say, what do you think is going to happen here? Our client has to make an investment decision now for something that may not come to fruition for another few years.
And we are generally telling our clients that the further along they are, so if they're getting federal funding, if they have the signed agreement, they're in pretty good shape no matter what happens on the political front. If they've made critical investment decisions, they've got a strong argument to make to Congress that you don't want to repeal those tax credits. And I think people are already making those arguments.
If I make two more observations based on things Marianne said. So Marianne mentioned tech and energy tech and power tech being a big deal. One thing that we've been watching, a trend, is that a lot of investors are looking to make small investments in emerging technology or other sort of power adjacent opportunities. They may not take the plunge and buy the company outright, but if they have a little bit of exposure, that gives them some element of participating, but it's not, huge risk, huge reward. And some investors, and I'm talking about corporate strategics, I'm talking about financial sponsors, might do a bunch of little investments in order to do that. And I think that's an interesting trend that we've been watching really since the IRA. And then another point that I think is worth noting, we obviously have clients all over the globe, but the nearshoring trend that is not unique to this sector, bringing manufacturing and jobs back to the United States, something that both candidates emphasize, I think that is going to yield lots of deal making, hopefully for my team here. I think that is illustrated by critical minerals deals that we're doing in the U.S. I think we've seen more mining deals recently, anecdotally, than in recent times. And I think that will continue regardless of administration.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. When we think about fossil fuel exploration and production, we all remember Sarah Palin's famous drill baby drill, and, the Republicans seem to really want to get it out there and open up federal lands for drilling and exploration. How do you see that being affected based on this election? Would we see drilling come back into the discussion if Trump took over again?
I think it's going to come back into the rhetoric, but we have to recognize that oil and gas production in the U.S. is at an all-time high under the Biden administration. Now, will there be whole new areas of federal lands, particularly that may be adjoining sensitive areas, opened up under a Harris administration? Probably not. Under a Trump administration, I think he's been pretty clear that he supports opening up federal lands to more oil and gas development. But again, investors are going to be looking at the big picture and the long term, and are they going to want to dive right in to drill baby drill if they think demand is headed in the other direction? That remains to be seen. So I think that's an area where no matter what the politics say, what industry is prepared to do, where they're prepared to invest, is likely to drive the amount of expansion of oil and gas drilling.
I think a little dose of realism is always helpful. I think one piece from this conversation that's always missing is we use still lots of oil and gas in this country. We're going to continue to use a lot of oil and gas in this country. Lots of things point to that being on the downward trend. But for the near term, we still will need oil and gas for our plastics, for our gas guzzling cars that we like to drive in this country. So I don't see that going away anytime soon under either administration.
And there's an inflation threat. Yeah. If you cut the supply, the price will go up. So I think a Harris administration would be very conscious about the need to meet near and medium term demand while keeping an eye on and pursuing the long term lower carbon future.
Mm-hmm. When you think about the electric grid and reliability and resilience of the grid, we've obviously talked a lot already about the investments being made in the infrastructure and the IRA and money being spent. Is there a difference between what we would see with as far as grid reliability from either administration, or can we just expect that these investments are going to be made either way?
I fully expect that either administration is going to support policies that assure the reliability and resilience of the grid. Relative to other buckets of money under the IIJA and the IRA, the grid has gotten relatively modest amounts. They've gotten some, but not the huge amounts that have gone into some other areas, like hydrogen, for example. But grid development seems to me to be driven more by industry than by government policy. They have obligations to serve. They make their money on capital investments. So I really would not expect to see a big change in policies towards the grid. Building transmission is difficult. Under a Democratic administration, under a Republican administration, people don't like to look at power lines, but the reality is we are going to need a significant technologically enhanced transmission grid build out to meet known coming needs. And that's true no matter who's in the White House.
And I might add that another piece of reliability and resilience is security, like cybersecurity. There have been some high-profile recent cybersecurity attacks on important energy infrastructure. Both administrations should be concerned with that. It seems that the Republican platform has brought that issue to the fore more prominently, but certainly something that we all should be concerned with.
What about interstate energy commerce and regulations and maybe the differences that might play out in FERC, for example, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission? Would the different administrations go in different directions there?
So one of our colleagues, Neil Chatterjee, is former FERC chair, and he would emphasize and he's Republican, he would emphasize the differences. I've been in this space for a long time, and I have never seen big lurches in policy at FERC. There are two organic acts, the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act, focus primarily on economic regulation, not on big policy issues. And the courts have increasingly been telling FERC that it needs to go back and pay more attention to the climate impact as part of any public interest analysis it's required to do. And what the court's view on that isn't going to change in a hurry depending on who's in the White House. So I don't see FERC as an area where we're likely to see dramatic changes. There'll be some changes at the edges, more focus on grid security rhetoric than on climate security rhetoric. But actual changes in regulatory policy, I'm not sure there'll be much.
You mentioned Neil Chatterjee, and I actually have had him on the podcast previously, and if my memory serves me correctly, he even talked about carbon pricing back at that time, and I believe he was in favor of it. Is there any traction that could be made in carbon pricing or emissions trading systems under a new administration?
I see no serious support, groundswell of support, necessary levels of support to put a price on carbon. It gets talked about because it's a market type mechanism. Republicans tend to favor it more than Democrats. But having seen multiple administrations that have talked about climate change in various different ways, I have not seen a real push for carbon pricing. The Democrats like carrots. They like the incentives, give people money, give people tax credits to accomplish their objectives, not make them pay a price for their carbon emissions. I don't really see a big change in that coming. But now Megan's got a different perspective because of the deals she does, which are driven in part by state renewable portfolio standards. So Megan, maybe you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So from my perspective as the deal lawyer, there are lots of projects and investments that clients might make as a result of those renewable portfolio standards at the state level to enable those who need to comply with the RPS. And so I might get involved in one of those. But I agree with everything Marianne said. It seems unlikely at the federal level to move, in contrast to Europe, frankly.
REC trading, renewable energy credit trading, or zero emissions credit trading happens, but it happens at the state level. It is not driven out of Washington. And I don't see that changing.
Well, Marianne and Megan, I thank you for your time. We've talked quite a bit. Is there anything that maybe we haven't discussed that you feel would be important before we wrap up the podcast?
Two areas that it seems to me that people should be focused on. Trump's team seems much more ready to move on policy than it did when he ran the last time. I think they're thinking about it in advance. They're building a desired set of policies. They may or may not be talking about them. Some they are talking about, some I think they're not. For example, I did not see a big change at the Department of Energy in most respects during the last Trump administration following Obama. I do expect them to be more ready to move on their policy objectives. And the other thing is the Supreme Court struck down Chevron deference, and that is going to put a higher premium on agencies doing deeper scientific and technical analysis if they want to support big policy changes without changes in the law. So those are two areas that I think will affect things in the coming few years.
Megan, anything that you can add?
Nothing other than I am excited about the volume of deals that I expect to come regardless of who is in office. And I think that we're in a great time in that there's so many investment opportunities, big and small, new entrants into the market of energy and power, and, things as simple as recycling old infrastructure, turning an old traditional diesel refinery into a renewable diesel facility, or turning an old coal power plant into a solar farm because it has lots of land that's not going to be used otherwise. I'm excited to see what the future brings.
Yeah, it will be interesting to watch. So, again, for listeners, I've been speaking with Anne Sullivan, Senior Counsel with Hogan Lovells, and Megan Ridley-Kaye, partner with Hogan Lovells. So thank you both for joining me. It's been an interesting conversation, and I guess we'll watch the election and see how it plays out. Thank you.
Glad for the opportunity to talk to you.
Likewise. Thank you.